The morning sun spilled over Fort Ridge Military Base, painting the steel hangars and rows of barracks in soft gold. Trucks rumbled, boots clattered, and sharp voices carried across the parade ground as soldiers prepared for another long day of drills and reports. Amid the noise, no one noticed the lone figure stepping out of a government jeep near the admin building. A woman in a neat gray uniform, hair tied back, posture straight but unassuming. Her name was Elena Brooks. There was something unusual about her presence, though it wasn't easy to define. She didn't stride like the officers, nor shrink like the recruits. She walked with quiet confidence, the kind that drew no attention but commanded it once noticed. Her suitcase was small, her papers neatly folded in a worn leather folder. To anyone watching, she looked like an administrative worker, maybe an assistant sent to handle reports or supply records. Nothing more. When she entered the registration office, Corporal James looked up from his desk and blinked. Morning, ma'am. You're from the Pentagon? He asked, squinting at the signature on her orders. Yes, Elena replied softly. Her voice was even calm. Temporary assignment. The corporal frowned, scanning the papers again. They bore an official seal and a personal signature from General Rourke, the commanding officer of the entire division. That alone was enough to make him sit straighter. Still, the woman in front of him didn't look like someone sent by a general. She looked ordinary, too calm, too quiet. He cleared his throat awkwardly. You'll be working in the admin office, ma'am. I'll have someone show you to your desk. Elena nodded, thanked him, and walked down the narrow corridor. The rhythmic sound of her low heels echoed softly, almost in harmony with the clatter of typewriters and the buzz of conversation. The other officers barely looked up as she passed. A few curious glances, a few polite nods. No one knew who she really was, and that was exactly how she preferred it. By lunchtime, word had already spread. New lady at admin, quiet one, probably a clerk. Fort Ridge was a place built on reputation, rank, and rumor. Soldiers who stood out, whether through excellence or mistakes, were talked about endlessly. Those who didn't, they were invisible. And Elena Brooks seemed content to stay invisible. In the mess hall, she sat alone at the end of a long table, eating quietly, while reading a folder of base protocols. Two young recruits whispered a few tables away. She doesn't talk to anyone. Maybe she's one of those government auditors. Or maybe she's just shy. Shy? On a base like this? Nah, probably just scared of the big dogs. They chuckled, and Elena heard every word. But she didn't look up, didn't react. She turned a page, eyes calm, mind sharper than anyone guessed. She had learned, long ago, that silence unsettled people more than words. Fort Ridge had its share of problems. Leadership inconsistencies, missing reports, sloppy discipline. Elena knew all of it before she arrived. Her transfer wasn't random. She'd been assigned there directly by the Pentagon's Office of Command Integrity, a unit that conducted secret inspections on military installations suspected of morale and conduct issues. Her mission: observe, document, and report, without anyone realizing she was doing it. To succeed, she had to disappear into the background. For years, Elena had been called many things: quiet, cold, distant. Few knew the weight she carried behind that calmness. Before her days in internal command audits, she had served in active combat intelligence, a role that required patience, silence, and observation. She'd seen arrogance destroy units, pride blind officers, and mockery ruin potential leaders. So when she walked into Fort Ridge and saw the smirks, the sideways glances, the casual disrespect between ranks, she recognized the warning signs immediately. This wasn't just a base in need of evaluation. It was one that had forgotten humility. Later that afternoon, she reported to the base commander's office. Colonel Marcus Heller. He was a tall man, built like a wall, with sharp eyes and an air of impatience. "So you're the new admin specialist?" he said, glancing at her file. "Yes, sir," Elena said, standing straight. "You've got authorization from the Pentagon. Impressive signature. But we weren't expecting visitors." "Just a short-term placement, sir," she replied. "I'll be handling logistics reports." Heller nodded, but his expression was skeptical. "Fine. Just stay out of the way. We've got drills, an inspection next month, and I don't have time to babysit a civilian paper pusher." "Yes, sir," she said evenly, then left his office. As the door shut behind her, Heller's adjutant muttered, "Doesn't look like much." Heller snorted. "Probably isn't." Over the next week, Elena's presence became routine, almost invisible. She arrived early, reviewed files, and walked the base during training hours. She asked small questions. Why the inventory count didn't match the transport records? Why the communication tower logs were incomplete? The officers dismissed her curiosity as harmless bureaucratic busywork. They didn't know she was already compiling a pattern, and that her quiet notebook contained enough details to trigger a full federal review. But it wasn't the data that told her the truth. It was the people. She saw how certain sergeants barked orders without respect, how younger soldiers rolled their eyes when no one looked, how morale was slipping under pressure and pride. The base looked efficient on paper, but was cracking at its core. And every evening, Elena wrote her quiet reports, never judging, only documenting. Still, it wasn't long before her silence became the subject of jokes. "She's like a ghost," someone said. "Maybe she's spying on us," another laughed. "Yeah, right? What's she gonna do? File us to death?" The laughter rolled down the hallways, harmless to them, but revealing everything she needed to know. Because the truth about arrogance is simple. It speaks loudest when it thinks no one important is listening. One evening, while she was reviewing files in the dim light of the admin block, a janitor stopped by her desk. An older man, gray-haired and kind-eyed, he cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, you probably don't want to hear this, but folks talk," he said quietly. "They think you're just here for show. Don't let them get to you." Elena smiled faintly. "I've heard worse, thank you. You don't seem like the type who scares easy," he said. "I'm not here to be liked," she replied. "I'm here to learn." The man chuckled softly. "Then you're in the right place. This base has got more lessons than it knows." When he left, Elena leaned back, staring at the file in her hands. It contained discrepancies, missing fuel records, incomplete training attendance, and false safety certifications. Small details maybe, but together they painted a picture of complacency. Picture that someone had to fix. That night, as the lights of Fort Ridge flickered in the distance, Elena stood outside her quarters, the cold wind tugging at her jacket. From somewhere across the base, she heard laughter, loud, careless, echoing. Soldiers were gathered near the barracks, telling stories, mocking, boasting. She smiled faintly, not from amusement, but from understanding. Every laugh, every careless word, they were setting the stage for something greater. They thought she was invisible. But soon, every single one of them would remember the day the quiet woman walked onto their base. And none of them would ever laugh again. By the second week, Helena Brooks had become a mystery everyone at Fort Ridge felt they had the right to solve. Her quiet footsteps, her perfectly pressed uniform, her solitary lunches, all of it fed the rumor mill that never slept. "Who eats alone every day?" whispered Private Allen as he scraped his tray beside a group of recruits in the mess hall. "Maybe she doesn't like us," said another. "Nah," Sergeant Davis interrupted, smirking. "She's just scared of talking to real soldiers. Probably never seen combat in her life." The table erupted in soft laughter. Across the hall, Elena sat by the window, reading a thick binder of personnel protocols as sunlight streamed over her shoulder. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. Her expression remained neutral, calm, almost serene. But inside, she was listening to every word. Years in military intelligence had sharpened her instincts to notice what others missed: tone, rhythm, silence between laughter. To Elena, those small things revealed more about a person's discipline than any formal report. And what she heard at Fort Ridge disturbed her deeply. The mockery wasn't just about her. It reflected a culture of casual disrespect, of unchecked arrogance. Later that day, she stood outside the motor pool, clipboard in hand, watching a maintenance crew joke while working on vehicles. The soldiers barely acknowledged her presence. One of them, Corporal Finch, turned to his friend and said loudly, "Careful, boys. The ghost lady's taking notes again. Don't smile too much, or she write you up." The others chuckled. Elena raised her gaze slowly, her calm eyes meeting Finch's for the first time. He expected her to fumble or turn away. Instead, she smiled faintly and replied, "You should worry less about smiling and more about that oil leak under your axle. It's been dripping for 40 minutes. The laughter stopped. Finch looked down and saw the puddle. She turned and walked away before he could reply. The men watched her go, unease replacing amusement. That night, Elena filed her daily report under encryption protocols. She recorded behavioral notes, supply inconsistencies, and an observation that morale appeared to rely more on hierarchy than respect. Her tone was factual, not emotional, the way professionals wrote when they knew their words might later decide careers. At the bottom of her report, she added one line in her personal remarks section. "This base mistakes noise for confidence. They still don't understand that quietness can be a form of strength." The next morning brought drizzle and heavy gray skies. Soldiers ran drills in the mud, shouting over the rain. Elena stood at a distance beneath her umbrella, taking notes. She wasn't required to attend field activities, but she did anyway, observing, documenting leadership behavior. Lieutenant Harper, a confident young officer known for his charisma, spotted her. "Ma'am," he called out sarcastically over the rain, "you might want to stay inside. Wouldn't want those fancy shoes ruined." A few soldiers laughed. Elena didn't respond. She simply turned a page on her clipboard and wrote something down. Harper frowned slightly, unsure if she was ignoring him or evaluating him. Either way, he suddenly didn't find the joke funny. Back in the admin block, word spread quickly. "She writes everything down," muttered one sergeant. "Probably tattling to HQ," another said. Davis leaned back in his chair and smirked. "She's harmless. I checked. She's listed as civilian consultant. That means she's just here to shuffle papers." Someone asked, "Then why is she always around during drills?" "Because she's nosy," Davis said. Some clerk trying to look important. The others nodded, accepting that version of truth. No one thought to question why a clerk had a Pentagon clearance badge clipped to her folder. That evening, Elena was called into Colonel Heller's office. He didn't look happy. "Miss Brooks, I've received complaints from my men," he said, tapping a pen on his desk. "They say you've been walking around inspections, taking notes, asking odd questions. You're making them nervous." "I see," she replied evenly. "I understand you have authorization," he continued. "But if you're here to evaluate logistics, you should stick to paperwork. Let my officers handle the field operations." "With respect, Colonel," she said, "sometimes paperwork doesn't show what's actually happening on the ground." Heller's jaw tightened. "Are you implying my officers aren't reporting accurately?" "I'm saying," she said calmly, "that accuracy is best confirmed by observation." There was a pause. The colonel stared at her, visibly irritated. Then, with a forced smile, he said, "Understood. Just be discreet and try not to step on toes." "I always am, sir," Elena said, standing. As she left his office, Heller muttered under his breath, "Who does she think she is?" If only he knew. The following day, Fort Ridge buzzed with fresh rumors. A rumor that the quiet woman was secretly married to a general. Another that she was writing a tell-all report on misconduct. A third that she'd been sent to replace someone soon to be fired. Each version was more dramatic than the last. To most, Elena was a curiosity, an odd piece in a puzzle they didn't understand. But to a few, her silence had become unsettling. Sergeant Davis noticed she was often near the armory and mess inventory, checking details others ignored. He began warning others to watch what you say around her. But it was already too late. She'd seen enough. That weekend, the base held an informal social evening. Barbecue, music, laughter. Elena was there, quietly sipping water and watching from a corner table. A few soldiers tried to draw her into conversation. "So, Miss Brooks," said Finch, half drunk, "what's your story? You spy or something?" Elena smiled politely. "Something like that." The table erupted with laughter, thinking she was joking. "Come on," another soldier grinned. "You really from the Pentagon?" She met his eyes, her smile fading. "Yes." The laughter died instantly. But before anyone could press further, she excused herself and walked into the cool night, the hum of awkward silence following her. Back in her quarters, she opened her encrypted tablet and uploaded that day's findings. Her report was longer than usual, not because of any new violation, but because the behavioral culture on the base had become her primary concern. She wrote carefully, "Fort Ridge personnel exhibit a recurring pattern of informal insubordination masked as humor. Leadership fails to correct it. Observed consistent dismissive behavior toward civilians and women. Recommend continued covert observation." Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added another note in her personal log. "They think I am invisible. That is my greatest advantage." By Sunday evening, the base settled into its usual rhythm. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they grew louder. Some called her the ghost, others Commander's pet. One group even started a bet, jokingly guessing how long before the quiet woman snapped or quit. But Elena didn't break. She never did. She had seen arrogance in all its forms, from young recruits to seasoned colonels. It always began the same way, with laughter. Laughter that underestimated, laughter that dismissed, laughter that blinded. And she knew exactly how to let that laughter destroy itself. For now, she would wait. Her silence was her weapon, her patience her shield. And when the moment came, when the truth revealed itself, every whisper, every joke, every careless smirk would echo back on them. Because soon, they would all discover that the quiet woman on base wasn't the one being tested. She was the one conducting the test. The morning mist hung over Fort Ridge like a curtain, softening the roar of engines and the barked commands of drill sergeants. Soldiers moved briskly across the yard, unaware that their smallest actions were being quietly recorded, not by cameras, but by the watchful eyes of Elena Brooks. For 2 weeks, she had played her role flawlessly, the polite, unremarkable civilian consultant. The soldiers' jokes and whispers had not only stopped bothering her, they had become useful. Their overconfidence made them careless, and in their carelessness, she found truth. Elena had been trained to disappear, to become invisible until the moment invisibility no longer served her purpose. Her mission was delicate, a covert internal evaluation for the Pentagon's Command Integrity Division. The division handled sensitive operations, rooting out corruption, inefficiency, and moral decay within key military installations. Fort Ridge had come under quiet scrutiny after a string of coincidental, supply discrepancies, and unreported disciplinary failures. The higher-ups needed someone with a keen mind and a cold calm, someone who could blend in without being suspected. That someone was her. Each morning, Elena walked the base with a simple clipboard, appearing to check routine maintenance. In truth, she was conducting a psychological map of the entire command structure, identifying who truly led, who merely wore rank, and who buckled under pressure. When she passed through the motor pool, she noted that soldiers often ignored safety gear. When she walked by the communications tower, she quietly timed the response delay between radio calls. When she visited the supply depot, she observed that certain crates were signed out but never used. By noon, she would return to her desk and file small, unassuming notes, but the codes in her reports told another story entirely. One rainy afternoon, Elena stood beneath the eaves of the hangar, observing an argument between Lieutenant Harper and Sergeant Davis. The lieutenant had caught Davis falsifying fuel records, but instead of correcting him, Harper dismissed it. "Nobody's going to notice," he said, waving a hand. "Just fix it later." Elena didn't move, didn't intervene. She simply noted the exchange in her book. To her, this moment revealed everything. Complacency at the top, arrogance below. The truth wasn't in the mistakes themselves. It was in how they were excused. Later, while reviewing the armory logs, she found that several entries had been altered. Timestamps changed, weapon serials swapped. It was small enough to seem harmless, but small cracks could shatter an entire foundation if ignored. That evening, she contacted her handler through a secure satellite channel, transmitting encrypted data to the Pentagon. Observation period, 17 days. Early signs confirm administrative neglect and cultural decline. Recommend extended operation. No exposure risk detected. After sending the report, she sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the base outside her window. The lights flickered in the drizzle, casting long shadows across the muddy field. Somewhere out there, laughter echoed from the barracks. She wondered how long that laughter would last. The next morning, Elena was summoned to Colonel Heller's office again. He didn't look angry this time, more curious, maybe even cautious. "Miss Brooks," he said, leaning forward, "I've been hearing things. You've been checking into systems outside your clearance zone. The armory, the communication tower, even the mess inventory." Elena met his gaze steadily. "All within authorization, sir?" He frowned. "Authorization for what, exactly?" She let the silence linger. "Efficiency review, Colonel. As per Pentagon protocol, 9242B. He blinked. That number wasn't random. It was a genuine code, one that very few outside high-level command even knew existed. For a moment, his authority faltered. Then he forced a chuckle. "Of course, just remember to keep me in the loop. No surprises." "Understood, sir," she replied, then turned to leave. As she reached the door, he called after her. "Miss Brooks, what exactly are you looking for?" She paused. "The truth, Colonel. It's usually hiding in plain sight." By the third week, tension began to simmer. Soldiers who had once mocked her now whispered more cautiously. Her presence no longer seemed harmless. It was starting to feel dangerous. Sergeant Davis told the others, "She's not just a clerk. She's watching us for something." "Watching you, maybe?" Finch laughed. "You're the one who fakes half your reports." "Shut up," Davis snapped. The base had started turning on itself, paranoia creeping in like fog through the barracks. Elena noticed it all, quietly satisfied. Pressure revealed character faster than comfort ever could. That Friday, she attended a drill review in the training yard. The unit was supposed to perform a simulated response exercise under strict time constraints. Lieutenant Harper led it, confident, loud, and dismissive. When the alarm rang, The soldiers moved with energy, but no coordination. Harper barked orders that contradicted each other, while Davis rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath. The chaos lasted 8 minutes before Harper called it off, frustrated. Elena had timed the whole thing. The operation that should have taken 3 minutes had taken nearly 9. She wrote one line on her notepad: "Command failure begins where arrogance refuses correction." When she lowered her pen, she noticed Harper glaring at her. "You got something to say, Miss Brooks?" he demanded. "No, Lieutenant," she said softly. "Just taking notes." That night, the officers gathered at the lounge for drinks. The rain pounded outside as laughter filled the room, though it was strained this time. "She's not normal," Finch said. "Nobody stays that calm all the time." "She's got the general's signature on her orders," Davis added. "You ever seen that before?" "Because I haven't." "Maybe she's a spy," Harper said, half joking. "Or maybe she's here to find who's been screwing up the reports." The laughter that followed was nervous, not mocking. They didn't know it yet, but their instincts were right. Meanwhile, Elena walked through the empty hangar alone, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. She stopped by an aircraft logbook, flipping through the records. Someone had altered flight times, subtle changes that would have gone unnoticed if she hadn't memorized the original copies days ago. She took photos, uploaded them to her secure drive, and closed the book. Then, softly, she said to herself, "It's always the same. They hide behind laughter until it's gone." Her voice barely rose above the hum of the night lights, but it carried an unshakable conviction, a certainty born of years in silence. The next morning, her findings reached the Pentagon. Her superior, General Rourke, reviewed her data personally. When he saw the extent of the neglect, he made a decision that would shake Fort Ridge to its core. "Initiate Phase 2, he ordered. For Elena, that meant one thing: the inspection would become official and public. But no one on the base knew. Not yet. As she walked across the parade ground that evening, several soldiers stepped aside quietly, giving her more space than before. The laughter had faded. The whispers had turned into silence. They didn't mock her anymore. They watched her. And in their eyes, she saw the beginning of fear, not of punishment, but of realization. Because somewhere, deep down, they were starting to suspect the truth. The quiet woman they had laughed at wasn't here to fit in. She was here to decide who deserved to stay. The dawn came heavy and gray over Fort Ridge, the kind of sky that made even the most disciplined soldiers drag their boots a little slower. But today was no ordinary morning. The entire base had been summoned for an urgent assembly on the parade ground at 0700 hours. Rumors swirled like dust before a storm. Some said it was about funding cuts. Others whispered that someone had been caught stealing. A few dared to wonder if the mysterious civilian consultant had something to do with it. Elena Brooks stood at the far edge of the formation, silent as ever, her dark coat catching the wind. Unlike the others, she already knew why they were here. Phase 2 had been activated. The quiet evaluation was over. Today, the truth would begin its reckoning. At precisely 0700, a convoy of black government SUVs rolled through the gates. Their arrival silenced the entire yard. Out stepped a group of officers in crisp dress uniforms, the kind that didn't belong to Fort Ridge. At their head was General Marcus Rourke, a man whose reputation alone could make battalions stand straighter. He was known across the Pentagon as a ghost maker, not because he killed men, but because his investigations ended careers so completely it was as though the people had never existed. The Colonel Heller hurried forward to greet him, his nerves barely contained beneath his salute. "General Rourke, sir." "What an unexpected." Rourke raised a hand. "Spare me the courtesy, Colonel. We'll keep this brief." He turned toward the assembled troops. Fort Ridge, His voice boomed across the square. Has been under review for several weeks. A covert performance audit ordered directly from the Pentagon. Today, the findings will be addressed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the ranks. Soldiers glanced at one another in disbelief. Some frowned. Others went pale. Rourke continued, his gaze scanning the crowd like a hawk. Before I proceed, I want to acknowledge the person responsible for uncovering the truth. He turned, extending a hand toward the quiet woman at the edge of the formation. Elena Brooks, he said. Or, as you will now address her, Commander Brooks. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, shock, and silence so absolute it felt like time itself had stopped. Finch's mouth fell open. Harper blinked as though he'd misheard. Davis actually muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Commander Brooks stepped forward, her composure flawless. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. Her expression was unreadable, calm, professional, almost regal. Colonel Heller's jaw clenched. "Commander?" he repeated, voice shaking slightly. "As in, Naval Intelligence Command," Rourke interrupted. "Temporarily reassigned under the Department of Defense to evaluate leadership integrity and operational discipline across select Army installations." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your installation, Colonel?" Elena walked to the center of the parade ground. Her boots hit the concrete with deliberate precision, a sound that echoed against the buildings. When she reached the podium beside Rourke, she surveyed the rows of faces before her. "I was sent here under civilian cover," she began, her voice calm but carrying clearly. "My task was simple: observe without interference, document without bias, and report without hesitation." She let her eyes sweep across the soldiers, the same ones who once laughed at her, ignored her, dismissed her as a quiet clerk. "I observed a lack of discipline, a culture of negligence, and a chain of command that tolerated failure." Her tone didn't rise, but the words hit harder than any shout could have. Records were falsified, safety procedures ignored, supplies mismanaged. This is not the standard of the United States Armed Forces. It is a shadow of it. Her eyes briefly locked with Lieutenant Harper's. He looked away. "Leadership," she continued, "is not about shouting loudest or wearing the most stars. It is about accountability, especially when no one is watching." The soldiers shifted uneasily. The humiliation began to settle in. Rourke took over. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Harper and Sergeant Davis are suspended pending court-martial review. The entire logistics department will undergo a forensic audit. Harper tried to protest. "Sir, this is completely out of what, Lieutenant?" Rourke snapped. "Out of your control?" "Yes, it is." The general's voice was cold, clinical. "When a soldier fails, we correct. When an officer fails, we investigate. When an entire base fails, we rebuild it." He turned back toward Elena. "Commander Brooks' findings have been verified by the Pentagon Oversight Committee. Her authority on this installation is absolute until further notice." The declaration hit harder than any punishment. Elena was no longer the quiet outsider. She was now the one with the power to judge them all. The rest of the morning unfolded like a slow, public unmasking. Files were collected. Barracks were searched. Digital logs were seized. Elena moved through it all with the same composure she'd always had, quiet, methodical, unshaken. Only now, every step she took was followed by a trail of wary, humbled soldiers. Colonel Heller tried to recover his dignity. "Commander, with respect, if there were concerns, I should have been informed sooner." "You were informed," she replied evenly. "You just didn't realize it." He swallowed hard. Rourke stepped in, his tone final. "Colonel Heller, you will remain in command until the inquiry concludes, under her direct supervision." Dismissed. The colonel saluted stiffly, his pride wounded beyond repair. Later that afternoon, as the storm clouds broke and sunlight cut through the gray, Elena stood on the observation deck overlooking the base. The chaos below had quieted into an uneasy order. For the first time in weeks, drills were running on schedule. Equipment was being checked properly. The soldiers moved with newfound discipline, not out of respect, but out of fear. Finch approached her cautiously. "Commander, I just wanted to apologize. We didn't know who you were." Elena turned her head slightly. "You shouldn't have needed to know." He looked down. "You're right." She didn't respond. Instead, she handed him a folded paper, a transcript of his maintenance report. "You have potential," she said. "Don't waste it copying other people's work." He nodded, eyes burning with embarrassment and gratitude all at once. "Thank you, ma'am." As he left, Elena allowed herself a brief, quiet sigh. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was exhaustion. Power never gave her pleasure, only responsibility. That evening, she was invited to the officers' mess. Rourke was there, reviewing data on his tablet. "You handled today well," he said without looking up. "I did what was necessary," she replied. He nodded. "They'll hate you for it, you know." "They already did," she said, allowing a faint, dry smile. Rourke finally looked at her. "Fort Ridge will recover. It always does. But you've reminded them of something they forgot. That silence doesn't mean weakness." He stood and extended a hand. "The Pentagon wants you to stay on for the remainder of the month. Finish what you started." She shook his hand. "Understood, sir." When she left the mess hall, the night air was sharp and cool. The base lights shimmered like scattered stars on the wet ground. From the shadows, a few soldiers watched her pass. Not with mockery this time, with something else, respect and a little fear. Elena paused at the gate, glancing back at the parade ground where everything had changed. Once, their laughter had followed her everywhere. Now, silence followed instead. And in that silence, discipline was finally returning. The morning after the inspection felt different at Fort Ridge. The base, once buzzing with careless chatter and clattering boots, now carried a heavy quietness. A quietness born not from peace, but from realization. Every soldier knew that their lives had changed. Every officer that their habits were under scrutiny. Commander Elena Brooks had turned their world inside out. The sun rose over the hangars, painting the base in streaks of gold and ash. Soldiers hurried through morning drills, movements sharper than ever. No one dared to be late. Even the mess hall, once filled with jokes and laughter, was subdued. Trays clattered softly. Conversations were whispers. At the center of it all, Elena sat alone, reviewing files with her coffee untouched. Her expression was unreadable, but her mind raced. She wasn't here to destroy Fort Ridge. She was here to save it from itself. Yet she could feel the eyes on her. The unease. The quiet resentment. She had exposed the cracks. Now she needed to rebuild what was left. Later that morning, General Rourke called her into his temporary office. He stood near the window, arms folded, studying the base from above. "They're shaken," he said simply. "They needed to be," Elena replied. He nodded. "Yes, but fear can only hold for so long. If you want lasting change, you'll have to give them something else, purpose." Elena tilted her head. "You think they're ready?" Rourke gave a thin smile. "You made them ready." He turned to her. "Starting tomorrow, Fort Ridge will host a joint training simulation with 2 neighboring installations. The Pentagon will observe. It'll be their chance to prove this base can stand again, and your chance to prove your command can lead." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. "Understood, sir." As she left the office, she knew what this meant. It wasn't just a test for the soldiers. It was a test for her, to see if she could command not just by authority, but by trust. That afternoon, she gathered the senior officers in the briefing room. Colonel Heller sat stiffly at the end of the table, still bruised in pride, but quiet. Lieutenant Harper and Sergeant Davis were absent, suspended pending investigation. Elena placed a set of folders on the table. This base has 1 week to prepare for the joint simulation. If we fail, it won't just be an embarrassment. It'll be a recommendation for shutdown. A low murmur spread across the room. She continued, tone steady but sharp. That means every department, every drill, every log will be reviewed again. And this time, it won't be me watching. It'll be Washington. A younger captain, Reese, leaned forward. Commander, with respect, morale is low. They're nervous, even scared. It's hard to get them motivated after, well, everything that's happened. Elena studied him for a moment, then stopped trying to motivate them with words. Show them results. Show them that order can be rebuilt. She paused, letting the silence sink in. We don't erase mistakes here. We correct them. Over the next several days, the transformation began. Elena walked the grounds from dawn to dusk, inspecting drills, reviewing schedules, and observing everything, not as a silent critic this time, but as a mentor. She corrected form errors in hand-to-hand sessions, adjusted communication protocols, and held short debriefs with squad leaders. Her tone was always calm, her feedback sharp but fair. For the first time, soldiers began to approach her not with fear, but with questions. Even Finch, the young recruit who once mocked her, found himself assigned under her observation. One afternoon, while they ran a field equipment test, he looked at her nervously. Commander, can I ask something? Go ahead. Why didn't you tell us who you were? Elena glanced at him. If I had, you'd have acted differently. And I needed to see how you acted when you thought no one important was watching. He frowned slightly. That's fair, I guess. She smiled faintly. Now you know. Always act as though someone's watching. Because true discipline doesn't need an audience. Finch nodded, the words settling into him like stone. By the 5th day, something remarkable began to happen. The base started to feel alive again, not with arrogance, but with pride. Soldiers pushed harder in drills. Reports were filed correctly. Equipment checks passed the first time. Even Heller, humbled by the exposure, began working alongside her instead of resisting. He approached Elena during an inspection and said, I didn't see it before, Commander. You weren't here to humiliate us, were you? She looked up from her clipboard. No, Colonel. I was here to remind you what the uniform means. He nodded solemnly. Then let me help you finish what you started. The day of the simulation arrived, like a final exam. 3 installations, including Fort Ridge, would coordinate a live multi-unit exercise, communication drills, logistics coordination, and mock crisis response. Observers from Washington stood on raised platforms, clipboards in hand. Elena watched from the command center, headset on, eyes fixed on the radar screens and communication feeds. Every second mattered. Bravo team status, she ordered. On course, Commander, came the reply. Supply convoy moving through Sector 3. Copy. Maintain formation. Colonel Heller stood beside her, relaying signals with renewed precision. The control room hummed with focus and efficiency. Then a sudden glitch. A miscommunication in the field led to a convoy taking a wrong route, veering into restricted territory. The oversight could cost them everything. Elena's voice cut through the radio chatter like a blade. Unit 6, adjust coordinates immediately. Reroute north by 70 meters. Acknowledge. Copy that, Commander. She exhaled slowly, the tension breaking. The observers exchanged approving glances. For 2 hours, the simulation continued flawlessly. Drills executed, orders followed, and coordination near perfect. When it ended, the lead observer nodded. Fork Ridge performed with exceptional improvement. General Rourke, watching from a distance, gave a rare smile. That evening, as the sun set behind the barracks, the soldiers gathered again on the parade ground. For once, not by order, but by choice. Elena stepped onto the platform. The crowd fell silent. "I came here under disguise," she said. "I saw arrogance, neglect, and failure. But I also saw potential, people capable of greatness when reminded what that word means." She paused, her eyes scanning faces now marked by humility and strength. "Respect," she continued, "isn't earned by how loud you speak or how high you rank. It's earned by how you serve, even when no one's watching." Then, for the first time since her arrival, she smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "And today," she said, "Fork Ridge has earned mine." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rising until it filled the air like thunder. Soldiers stood taller. Officers saluted her, not out of obligation, but out of pride. Later that night, Elena walked alone to the edge of the airstrip. The lights stretched into the horizon, and the wind carried faint echoes of laughter. Real laughter this time, not mockery. Rourke approached, hands behind his back. "You rebuilt them," he said quietly. "They rebuilt themselves," Elena replied. "I just reminded them how." He nodded. "Washington's impressed. They'll want your report by morning. After that, you move to your next assignment." She looked toward the stars. "Another base? Another storm to calm." Elena smiled faintly. "Then I'll be ready." As Rourke walked away, she stayed a moment longer, watching the runway lights flicker against the night. Fort Ridge was quiet now, disciplined, focused, whole again. And in that stillness, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Once they had laughed at the quiet woman on base. Now they stood because of her. The next morning dawned brighter than usual over Fort Ridge. For the first time in months, the base didn't wake to tension, but to purpose. Soldiers moved with rhythm. Laughter returned to the mess hall, and the once tired flag above the command building waved proudly again. Commander Elena Brooks stood at her office window, coffee steaming in her hand, watching the scene unfold. The sound of discipline had changed, no longer brittle, but confident. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the quiet satisfaction of restoration. But in her line of work, peace never lasted long. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A coded message flashed across the screen. "Return to Command HQ classified debrief. Immediate departure authorized." Elena exhaled slowly, lowering the mug. She had expected this. The mission was nearly complete, and the Pentagon would want answers, especially after the reports that had crossed their desks about Fort Ridge's transformation. But something about the timing felt too sudden, too sharp. When she stepped outside, she found General Rourke waiting near a government vehicle. His expression, as always, was unreadable, but his posture told her everything. "Orders came through," he said. "You're being recalled." "I figured," Elena replied, eyes narrowing slightly. "But you don't look pleased about it." Rourke hesitated. "There's been chatter in Washington. Someone doesn't like how quickly you turned this place around. They're calling your methods unconventional." Elena gave a faint, humorless smile. "Unconventional is how things get fixed." He nodded once. "I agree. But be careful. The higher you climb, the more the air thins, and the knives get longer." She met his gaze. "I've been breathing thin air my whole career, General." Rourke almost smiled. "That's why they keep sending you." By noon, The convoy was ready. The soldiers gathered along the driveway as Elena prepared to leave. She hadn't expected a send-off, but they stood there anyway. A line of uniforms, shoulders squared, eyes steady. Finch stepped forward and saluted sharply. "Commander Brooks, ma'am. On behalf of the enlisted personnel of Fort Ridge, thank you." Elena returned the salute, her voice softer than usual. "You earned this, not me. Don't forget that." Then she turned, climbed into the vehicle, and didn't look back. As the gates closed behind her, Fort Ridge faded into the distance, but its silence, its transformation, lingered in her mind. The drive to Washington was long, cutting through stretches of silent road and autumn fields. Elena's thoughts drifted between exhaustion and calculation. Every mission had its price. Every success, its consequence. When she finally reached the Pentagon, security escorted her through a series of sterile corridors. At the end waited a briefing room, lit by cold fluorescent lights. 3 officials sat at the table, 2 men in suits and a woman in uniform. A high-ranking Pentagon analyst named Admiral Reese. "Commander Brooks," Reese said without preamble, "your performance at Fort Ridge has generated considerable attention." Elena gave a crisp nod. "I did my job." "Yes," Reese said, leaning forward. "And in doing so, you uncovered a deeper issue. Your audit logs cross-referenced with 3 other bases, all showing similar irregularities. Falsified readiness reports, unverified supply chains, missing funds." Elena's brow furrowed. "You're saying this wasn't isolated?" "Exactly," the Admiral said. "It's systemic. Fort Ridge was just the tip." The man in the gray suit, a civilian intelligence director, spoke next. "We want you to lead a joint inter-branch task force. We're calling it Project Sentinel. Quiet, internal, deep." Elena's instincts immediately prickled. "You want another undercover operation?" Reese nodded. "Bigger this time. But before we proceed, we have a concern." The second man slid a folder across the table. Inside were surveillance stills. Photos of Elena at Fort Ridge. Some showed her instructing soldiers, others speaking directly to Heller and Rourke. "Your interaction with base personnel," he said coolly, "exceeded standard observer protocol. You established rapport. You gave commands without chain approval." Elena looked up, unimpressed. "I acted to prevent collapse. If I hadn't, Fort Ridge would have failed the simulation and possibly shut down entirely." The man smirked. "You broke protocol." She met his gaze evenly. "I saved a base." The silence that followed was heavy, but Admiral Reese's voice finally broke it. "That's enough. The Pentagon doesn't reward inaction." She turned to Elena. "You'll accept Project Sentinel, but this time you'll have full command authority." Elena paused. "Full command?" "Yes," Reese confirmed. "No disguise, no secrecy. You'll lead the entire investigation openly. You've proven you can handle soldiers. Now you'll handle the system." Hours later, Elena walked out of the Pentagon, the folder still in her hand. The night air was cool, and the weight of new responsibility pressed against her chest. She'd spent years in shadows, cleaning up the military's messes quietly. But this was different. It wasn't just an audit. It was an excavation. As she stood under the flagpole outside, she felt a familiar presence beside her. Long night? General Rourke stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the flag. "Long enough," she said. He nodded toward the folder. "Sentinel?" She raised an eyebrow. "You knew already." "Word travels fast when it shakes the Pentagon," he said dryly. "You're walking into a political storm, Elena." "I've lived in storms," she replied quietly. Rourke studied her for a long moment. "You've earned every bit of this. Just remember, leadership gets lonelier the higher you go. She smiled faintly. Then it's a good thing I've gotten used to silence. 2 weeks later, Alana's name was officially announced in a Pentagon press briefing. Commander Alana Brooks, Director, Project Sentinel. It was a rare acknowledgement for someone whose entire career had lived behind closed doors. The news spread quickly through military networks, eventually reaching Fort Ridge. Inside the mess hall, Finch nearly dropped his tray when he saw the broadcast. She's leading a national task force? Colonel Heller smiled faintly. She deserves it. She taught us more in a month than some learn in years. The soldiers nodded, a shared sense of pride flickering in their eyes. The quiet woman they once laughed at had become the face of integrity itself. Back in Washington, Alana sat in her new office overlooking the Potomac River. Stacks of files filled her desk, reports, testimonies, data logs. Every piece was a clue to a larger corruption. Her assistant entered. "Ma'am, the task force is assembled. They're waiting for you." Elena closed the folder in front of her and stood. "Then let's begin." She walked into the conference room, where a dozen officers and analysts waited. Faces turned as she entered, some curious, others skeptical. Elena placed her hands on the table and began. "You've all been chosen for one reason, because you don't look away when things get hard. This mission isn't about politics. It's about restoring the honor we swore to protect." Her tone hardened. "Fort Ridge taught me something, that corruption thrives in silence. We're here to break that silence." A murmur of assent rippled through the room. "From this day forward," Elena said, her voice steady, "Project Sentinel begins?" That night, long after the lights of the Pentagon dimmed, Elena sat by the window, staring out at the reflection of the city in the dark water below. Somewhere beyond those lights, soldiers were training, bases were running drills, and systems were grinding forward, all trusting that the people above them were honest. And she knew it was her duty to make sure that trust wasn't misplaced. She took a slow breath, closing her eyes. Once she had been laughed at for being quiet. Now her silence carried power, the kind that could rebuild or destroy. And as the clock struck midnight, Commander Alana Brooks, the once forgotten woman on base, opened the first classified file of Project Sentinel and turned the page toward a new war. Silence hung over Fort Ridge like a heavy fog the morning after Commander Alana Brooks' shocking reveal. The laughter that once echoed through the corridors was gone, replaced by a low, tense quiet. Every soldier seemed to walk a little straighter, speak a little softer. The memory of the general's words, "Commander Brooks, you have the floor," still burned in their minds. Elena had spent the night reviewing the final phase of her report. Her office once, a small, overlooked space tucked behind the communications center, was now a hub of movement. Files lay spread across the desk, each labeled meticulously. The base's top-ranking officers came and went under her quiet supervision, their faces drawn tight with unease. For months, they had mocked her, dismissed her questions, treated her as invisible. Now, every one of them waited for her judgment. Outside, the wind swept through the parade ground, carrying the faint sound of boots moving in formation. The soldiers were restless. The inspection had triggered a series of surprise evaluations across every department armory, logistics, engineering, and even administration. Every report, every log entry was now under review. Those who had laughed the loudest were now sweating under the scrutiny of Washington's best auditors. Colonel Harper, the base commander, stood at attention in her office. His jaw was tense, his pride visibly wounded. "Commander Brooks," he said stiffly, "I owe you an apology." "My men," Elena looked up from her papers, expression calm. "Respect starts at the top, Colonel," she interrupted gently. "If your men laughed, it's because they believed they could." The words hit him harder, than any reprimand could. He lowered his gaze, realizing just how deeply the culture had rotted under his command. For years, he'd prided himself on efficiency and discipline. But somewhere along the line, arrogance had replaced professionalism, and carelessness had become the norm. Elena continued, "You have good soldiers here, Harper. But they need leadership, true leadership, not intimidation." He nodded, his pride swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." As the day unfolded, the full scale of Elena's audit became clear. Officers were summoned to briefings, evidence was presented, and findings were read aloud in the mess hall. Every infraction, every neglected regulation, every falsified report, she had it all documented. The officers who had smirked during her inspections now stood in front of their peers, eyes wide with regret. Sergeant Davis, the one who'd called her the ghost woman, was among them. He stood rigid as the general addressed him. "Sergeant Davis," the general said, his voice even, "Commander Brooks has documented your involvement in 2 unauthorized training modifications, as well as failure to report safety violations. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Davis swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't think it mattered." Elena's voice was calm but sharp. "Everything matters, Sergeant. When safety doesn't matter, people get hurt. When discipline doesn't matter, missions fail. You may think it's small, but small cracks sink great ships." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, shame weighing on his shoulders. Throughout the day, more names were called, more consequences delivered. Some were disciplined, some were warned, but a few were recognized for integrity. Private Lewis, one of the youngest on base, had quietly followed every rule, even when others mocked him for trying too hard. Elena had noticed his diligence and recommended him for promotion. When his name was announced, the base was stunned. The same young soldier who had been laughed at for taking orders seriously now stood as an example of what the military was supposed to be. Elena made sure of that, because lessons should be both punishment and inspiration. By afternoon, the base had gathered for a formal assembly. The general stood before them once more, but this time it was Elena who addressed the crowd. Her presence was commanding yet composed. "I came here not to expose," she began, "but to remind. To remind you of what this uniform stands for. Honor, integrity, and unity. Somewhere along the way, some of us forgot that." Her voice carried across the parade ground, clear as a bell. "You thought I was just another face someone who didn't matter. But that's where you failed the most. Because in this service, everyone matters. From the private cleaning the barracks to the general giving commands." She paused, letting her words sink in. The soldiers stood perfectly still, every eye on her. "Laughter is easy," she said. "Respect is harder. It demands humility, patience, and understanding. Those who mocked, I forgive you. But I hope you've learned that the quietest voice in the room can still carry authority if it speaks with purpose." The general nodded approvingly behind her. The entire formation stood in silence, the weight of her message settling deep. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the atmosphere on base had changed completely. Conversations were hushed but thoughtful. Officers walked with newfound respect, and soldiers exchanged glances of quiet understanding. The transformation was palpable. In her quarters, Elena sat by the window, the last rays of sunset painting her desk in gold. Her laptop screen glowed with the final draft of her report. She added the last sentence. "Fort Ridge demonstrates the potential for greatness once it remembers humility." She closed the file and exhaled deeply. Her mission here was nearly done. There was a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Private Lewis standing at attention. "Commander," he said, "I just wanted to thank you for noticing." Elena smiled faintly. "You earned it, Private. Keep your integrity." It's the most valuable weapon you have." He saluted sharply before leaving, his steps light, his spirit lifted. After he left, Elena turned back to the view outside. The base lights flickered on one by one, glowing steadily in the twilight. For the first time since she'd arrived, Fort Ridge felt alive again. Order restored. Respect reborn. Later that night, Colonel Harper approached her as she prepared her departure files. "Commander," he said softly, "I've requested a meeting with my officers. We'll rebuild the leadership structure from scratch your way." Elena nodded approvingly. "Then my job here is complete." He hesitated. "You've changed this place, you know. I thought strength meant authority. You reminded me it means accountability." Elena looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Change doesn't start with speeches, Colonel. It starts when someone finally listens." When she stepped out into the cool night air, the stars stretched endlessly above her. She thought of all the bases, all the faces she'd encountered through the years. Every mission had one thing in common. People underestimated the quiet ones. They forgot that power wasn't in noise, it was in conviction. The next morning, as the transport helicopter prepared to take her to her next assignment, the entire base gathered one last time. When she appeared on the tarmac, hundreds of hands rose in salute. No laughter, no whispers, only respect. Elena paused, returned the salute, and boarded the helicopter. As it lifted off, she looked down one final time. Fort Ridge stood strong below, united again not by fear, but by understanding. Inside her heart, she carried the quiet satisfaction of a mission fulfilled. The reckoning had come not to destroy, but to rebuild. And in its wake, a base reborn. Because sometimes, it takes a quiet woman to remind an entire army what true command looks like. The helicopter blades churned the cool morning air, whipping dust across the tarmac as Commander Elena Brooks prepared to depart Fort Ridge. The base stood assembled in formation, every uniform crisp, every salute sharp. This time, no laughter followed her. Only silence, reverent and steady, filled the space where mockery once lived. As the aircraft began to lift off, Elena looked down from the small round window. From above, the base looked smaller than she remembered, a cluster of order and discipline carved into the desert floor. But in her heart, she knew it wasn't the same place anymore. It had changed because the people had changed. 3 months earlier, it had been a base full of arrogance and carelessness. Now, under Colonel Harper's renewed leadership and the soldiers' newfound unity, it had become something closer to what it was meant to be, a place of pride and purpose. The general had told her before she left, "You didn't just evaluate Fort Ridge, you healed it." But Elena didn't see herself as a savior. She saw herself as a reminder, a mirror showing them what they had forgotten. As the helicopter disappeared beyond the ridge, the men and women below slowly dispersed, carrying her lesson into their routines. That morning, the base wasn't just following orders. It was rebuilding trust, piece by piece. Back at the Pentagon 2 days later, Elena walked through the long marble halls, lined with portraits of commanders past. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and history. She carried her final report on Fort Ridge under her arm, the edges neatly sealed. When she entered the briefing room, senior officials rose instinctively. Respect followed her everywhere now, not because of her title, but because of the quiet weight of her reputation. General Merrick, the same man who had accompanied her during the final assembly, gave her a small nod. "Commander Brooks," he said, "your work has set a standard. The department is recommending new leadership training protocols based on your model." Elena gave a brief smile. "It's not a model, sir. It's a mindset." He chuckled. "A mindset that's spreading fast. Other bases have already heard the story." She tilted her head. "The story?" "Oh yes," Merrick said. "The troops call it the commander who walked among them. They've made it legend. Apparently, it's required reading material for new recruits now." Elena blinked in mild surprise, then allowed herself a soft laugh. "Stories travel faster than orders, I suppose." Merrick leaned forward, his tone turning sincere. "You did something that policy never could, Commander. You reminded them what integrity feels like." Those words stayed with her long after she left the building. Weeks later, Elena found herself on a small coastal base in Virginia. She was technically there on vacation, her first in nearly 2 years, but habits die hard. She still observed, still listened. The young recruits who passed her on the docks saluted politely, unaware of who she was. She liked it that way. One afternoon, she overheard 2 soldiers talking near the canteen. "You hear about that quiet woman at Fort Ridge?" One of them said. "The one the general called Commander? They say she was undercover for months." The other laughed. "Sounds like a myth. Stuff like that doesn't happen in real life." Elena smiled faintly from behind her coffee cup. Myths, she thought, are just truths told in whispers. Later, she sat by the shoreline, the sun painting streaks of gold across the water. The breeze carried the sound of laughter, light, respectful, genuine laughter. She watched a group of young cadets helping one another lift gear into a truck. There was teamwork, respect, a sense of unity she rarely saw in her early years. Maybe the story had done more good than she'd realized. Her phone buzzed. A message from General Merrick Reed. "Commander Brooks, Fort Ridge's new code of conduct has been implemented across 5 additional bases. Your principles are officially part of our leadership curriculum. Congratulations." Elena read it twice, then set the phone down beside her. The waves rolled gently at her feet, the air cool and cleansing. It wasn't victory she felt, it was peace. The quiet satisfaction that comes not from recognition, but from knowing the mission truly mattered. Meanwhile, at Fort Ridge, the transformation continued. Colonel Harper had taken her words to heart. He led by example, now joining drills, eating with the men, addressing mistakes openly. The arrogance that once defined the base was replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Sergeant Davis, once her loudest critic, had changed too. He now mentored younger soldiers on humility and respect. In the mess hall, he'd often say, "Don't underestimate the quiet ones. They're usually the ones watching the closest." Private Lewis, the young soldier Elena had promoted, had risen quickly through the ranks. During his first leadership briefing, he quoted her words, "Respect isn't given by rank, it's earned through character." The room had fallen silent as he spoke. Her influence, though she was gone, lived on in every corner of that base. Months later, Elena received an invitation of formal request to attend the Fort Ridge Reformation ceremony. She hesitated at first. She never liked ceremonies. They were too public, too polished. But curiosity won. When she arrived, the base was unrecognizable. The grounds were immaculate, the soldiers alert and disciplined. The air carried a sense of pride that wasn't forced, it was genuine. As she stepped onto the parade ground, hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Colonel Harper, now visibly older but far more grounded, greeted her with a firm handshake. "Welcome back, Commander," he said. "Fort Ridge owes you more than you know." Elena smiled politely. "You owe yourselves." I just held up the mirror. The ceremony began with the raising of the flag. Then Harper took the stage, addressing the formation. "Today, we celebrate not our strength, but our growth," he said. "We once laughed at the quiet woman who walked among us. But she taught us that leadership isn't volume, it's vision. And we've carried that lesson ever since." The applause that followed was not loud or chaotic. It was measured, sincere, powerful in its unity. Elena stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, emotion tightening her chest. She hadn't come for applause. But hearing those words, the acknowledgement of what they'd become, meant more than any medal or promotion ever could. After the ceremony, Private Lewis approached her again, now wearing a lieutenant's insignia. "Commander," he said warmly, "I've started writing a manual for new recruits. I called it the Quiet Commander's Code. Would you mind if I dedicated it to you?" Elena paused, eyes glistening with quiet pride. "Only if you remember," she said softly, "that the code isn't mine. It's yours. It belongs to anyone who leads with heart." He nodded solemnly, and she could see in him what she had always hoped to see, a leader, shaped not by fear, but by respect. That night, as she prepared to leave again, the base lights shimmered in the distance like stars grounded on Earth. She stood on the observation deck, the same spot where she had once been ignored and ridiculed. Now, the soldiers who passed her nodded respectfully. Some saluted quietly. Others simply smiled, grateful. Elena looked out across the base one last time. The wind brushed her hair back, carrying faint echoes of laughter, not mocking this time, but joyful. The kind that grows from pride and unity. And as she turned toward her transport, she whispered to herself, "True command doesn't shout. It leads quietly, until the world listens." With that, Commander Elena Brooks walked into the night, leaving behind not just a base, but a legacy. A legacy that would remind generations of soldiers that leadership isn't in the voice that's heard the loudest, but in the one that speaks with purpose, integrity, and quiet strength.